Ready? Let's begin. The Paracas skulls of Peru. In 1928, on the sun-scorched peninsula of Paracas on the southern coast of Peru, archaeologist Julio Tello pulled something from the sand that stopped his team cold. The skulls were enormous, not just large, but structurally wrong. Elongated far beyond anything in the known human fossil record, rising from the back of the cranium in a way that no amount of binding could fully explain. Over 300 of them were recovered from the Paracas Necropolis that season. 300 skulls that had no business being there. Tello was not an amateur. He was the founder of Peruvian archaeology, trained in the finest institutions of his era, and he knew immediately that what he was holding did not match any population he had ever studied. The Paracas culture had flourished along this coastline for over 1,000 years, between roughly 200 BC and 700 AD. They were skilled weavers, sophisticated traders, and clearly capable of complex cultural organization. But nothing in the anthropological literature prepared anyone for the scale of what the necropolis contained. Researchers who examined the skulls in detail noted that the cranial volume of certain specimens appeared significantly larger than that of a standard modern human skull. Standard artificial cranial deformation, the practice of binding an infant's head with boards and cloth to reshape the growing bone, does not increase total brain volume. It compresses and redirects existing bone. It reshapes. It does not expand. Yet the Paracas specimens, according to researchers including Brian Forster, who has spent years documenting the collection, showed volume that exceeded what compression alone could produce. Hair samples recovered, still attached to some skulls, showed reddish-brown pigmentation, a coloring not associated with indigenous South American genetic stock. The physical evidence was pointing somewhere unexpected. What made the Paracas discovery so difficult to dismiss was not any single anomaly. It was the convergence, the size, the shape, the pigmentation, and the sheer number of specimens all arriving from the same burial site in the same stratum. One strange skull is a curiosity. 300 is a population. If these were simply the result of a binding tradition taken to an extreme, the bone itself would tell that story clearly. The problem is that for some of these skulls, the bone is telling a different story entirely. The two parietal plate problem. Every human being born on this planet arrives with the same fundamental skull architecture. Two parietal plates meet at the top of the cranium along a seam called the sagittal suture. This is not a cultural artifact. It is not a tradition or a regional variation. It is a biological constant, present across every known human population, from the Paleolithic to the present day. Which makes one feature of certain elongated skulls, including some from the Paracas collection, so difficult to process. Some of them have only one parietal plate. This is not a trauma artifact. A blow to the skull does not fuse the sagittal suture and eliminate a plate. This is not what binding produces. Binding reshapes the two plates, pushing them upward and back. But they remain two plates, two separate structures meeting along their shared seam. A skull with a single parietal plate is not deformed. It is different. It is operating on a different biological blueprint from the beginning of its development. And that distinction matters enormously. The Ubaid culture of ancient Mesopotamia, flourishing between roughly 5,000 and 4,000 BC across modern-day Iraq, left behind a body of fired clay figurines that archaeologists have cataloged and quietly filed under ritual objects of unknown significance. Look at those figurines. The beings they depict have elongated heads, almond-shaped eyes, and proportions that sit outside the range of ordinary human representation. They are shown nursing infants with the same cranial shape. They are shown seated in postures of authority. They appear across multiple sites, including Tel al-Ubaid, Ur, and Eridu, spanning centuries of the same culture. The elongation they depict was not ceremonial. The figurines show it as hereditary. These Ubaid figurines are the oldest known depictions of what that civilization considered its ruling class, or perhaps something above its ruling class. No mainstream consensus exists on what they represent. Museum catalogs offer no agreed interpretation. The figurines simply sit in their cases, staring out with those long heads and narrow eyes, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Two parietal plates is not a tradition. It is not a fashion or a ritual. It is a biological fact shared by every human who has ever lived. The skulls that arrive with one plate are not deformed versions of us. They are something operating by a different set of rules from the very first moment of growth. The Sumerian texts already told us. Before law codes, before tax records, before any of the administrative machinery that characterizes early civilization, the Sumerians wrote theology. The very first things committed to clay tablets by the world's first literate culture were accounts of beings who arrived, reshaped humanity, and departed. These were not vague creation myths in the style of later religions. They read with the specificity of administrative records, naming individuals, describing family conflicts, assigning responsibilities, and documenting a genetic program carried out on an existing population. The oldest writing on Earth is, at its core, a personnel file for beings that should not exist. The Anunnaki, whose name translates from Sumerian as those who from heaven came to Earth, appear across the Enuma Elish and the Epic of Atrahasis as a governing class with internal politics, divided loyalties, and a specific agenda regarding the human population. The chief figures, Enlil and his brother Enki, are described in sustained conflict over the fate of humanity, one seeking to diminish it, the other to protect it. This is not the behavior of metaphor. This is the behavior of administrators with competing jurisdictions. The Sumerian king list, preserved on the Weld Blundell Prism, now housed in Oxford's Ashmolean Museum, and dated to approximately 2100 BC, records kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years before the flood. Mainstream scholarship classifies these reigns as mythological, but the texts don't frame them as myth. They frame them as history. Zecharia Sitchin, whose work on Sumerian texts, beginning with the 12th planet in 1976, remains deeply controversial, drew attention to the Sumerian term Lulu as a potential descriptor for the first humans, interpreting it as a reference to a mixed being. Mainstream Assyriology does not accept this translation, and it should be understood as Sitchin's reading, rather than established etymology. But the underlying textual references to the Anunnaki engineering a labor force from existing biological material are present in the source texts, regardless of how individual words are translated. The Sumerians did not worship abstract forces. They described physical beings with titles, genealogies, and technical responsibilities. Whether those beings were gods, kings, or something else entirely, the civilization that invented writing chose to spend its first clay tablets documenting them in extraordinary detail. The global elongated elite. In the royal city of Amarna, constructed by the pharaoh Akhenaten during his reign of approximately 17 years in Egypt's 18th dynasty, something unusual appears in every surviving piece of art. Every royal figure, from the pharaoh himself to his daughters and his queen Nefertiti, is depicted with a dramatically elongated cranium. For generations, Egyptologists filed this under artistic convention. The Amarna style, they argued, was simply a stylistic revolution, a deliberate break from the rigid formalism of earlier Egyptian art. The elongation was symbolic, not literal. Then some researchers began examining the royal mummies themselves more carefully, and certain CT analyses suggested the cranial elongation was not purely a painter's choice. Nefertiti's iconic bust, now housed in Berlin's Neuss Museum, shows a skull that rises steeply above a standard human cranial profile. The tall blue crown she wears in virtually every depiction may have been designed not merely as ceremonial headwear, but as a covering, calibrated to the actual shape of what sat beneath it. This remains debated. But it is a debate that the art alone makes unavoidable. The phenomenon is not Egyptian in origin. The Halsaflieni hypogam in Malta, a subterranean necropolis carved from limestone and dated to before 3000 BC, yielded elongated skulls from its burial chambers when excavated in the early 20th century. Dr. Anton Mifsud documented these specimens, and his records describe cranial structures consistent with the Paracas specimens. Those skulls subsequently disappeared from the Maltese archaeological record. Heritage authorities have not offered a confirmed explanation for their absence. Additional elongated skulls have been recovered from Varna in Bulgaria, dated to approximately 4500 BC, and from Boskop in South Africa, dated potentially as far back as 10,000 years ago. In every context where elongated skulls appear, they appear at the top, not beside the throne, not in commoner graves with modest offerings. At the apex of every society they touch, in the royal burials, in the high priest chambers, among the richest grave goods. Whatever these skulls represented to the cultures that preserved them, it was the highest thing they knew. The skull that broke the DNA lab. In approximately 2017, a fragment of a Paracas skull was sent to a laboratory in Europe for mitochondrial DNA analysis. Mitochondrial DNA is maternally inherited, passed from mother to child across thousands of generations with high fidelity, making it one of the most reliable tools available for tracing biological lineage. The researcher who authorized the testing, Brian Forster, expected unusual results. The skulls had already demonstrated enough physical anomalies to suggest something outside standard indigenous South American genetics. What he received from the laboratory was not unusual results. It was a result the laboratory described as belonging to a haplogroup unknown in any human, primate, or animal database. This claim has not been peer-reviewed. The laboratories involved have not been publicly confirmed by independent parties. The methodology has not been subjected to the kind of scrutiny that would allow mainstream science to either validate or definitively refute it. These are real limitations, and they matter, but they do not explain the result away. Contamination of a DNA sample introduces known human DNA, because the contaminant is always a human researcher or environmental source from the known human population. An unknown haplogroup in a contaminated sample is not what contamination produces. An unknown haplogroup means the original biological material itself contains a lineage with no identified living or fossil relatives anywhere in the known record. 3 separate laboratories across the United States, Canada, and Europe were used in the testing process to reduce the possibility of handling error. The results, according to Forster's reporting, were consistent across all 3. Mainstream institutions have declined to engage with the data. No government archaeological body has commissioned independent replication. The results exist in a kind of scientific limbo, too specific to dismiss as incompetence, and too unorthodox to absorb into the existing framework without consequences that reach far beyond one burial site in Peru. 3 labs, 3 continents, the same answer. At what point does the word unknown stop functioning as a placeholder and start functioning as a conclusion? The Nephilim parallel. In the book of Numbers, chapter 13, Moses sends 12 scouts into Canaan on a military intelligence mission. They return shaken. The land, they report, is occupied by the descendants of Anak, and standing beside them, the scouts say, "We felt like grasshoppers." The Hebrew word used to describe these beings is Nephilim. Its etymology, debated but widely derived from the root naphal, meaning to fall, suggests descent from above rather than emergence from the earth. The Nephilim are not described as a mythological race. They are described as a territorial reality that an advancing army needs to account for. Genesis 6, verse 4, is even more explicit. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of humans and had children by them. The text does not treat this as metaphor. It treats it as genealogy, a bloodline with a specific point of origin, a crossing between 2 distinct categories of being that produced a hybrid population with physical characteristics different from ordinary humanity. The Book of Enoch, a text considered canonical within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and dated to approximately the 2nd century BC, expands this account in forensic detail. 200 beings described as watchers descended on Mount Hermon, took human partners, and produced offspring of enormous physical stature. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran in 1947, fragments of the Book of Giants preserve an account of these hybrid descendants, their physical nature, and their prophetic dreams about their own eventual destruction. This text was not prominently featured in early publications of the Dead Sea Scrolls material, and its contents remain largely absent from mainstream biblical scholarship. The same tradition echoes across civilizations that had no documented contact with the Hebrew tradition. The Apkallu of Mesopotamia were 7 supernatural sages of non-human origin. The Greek Titans were the products of divine and earthly unions. The Hindu Asuras were a race of semi-divine beings in conflict with the gods. Every tradition agrees on the same structural detail. There was a crossing. It produced something that ruled, and something ended it. The Sumerians wrote it down first, the architecture they weren't supposed to build. In the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, at the site known as Baalbek, the Romans constructed what they called the greatest temple complex in the known world. They built the Temple of Jupiter, raising enormous columns of granite to heights that would not be surpassed in the Western world for over 1,000 years. But the Romans did not build the platform their temple stands on. That foundation was already there when they arrived. And in all of surviving Roman literature and engineering records, not a single text claims credit for it. The stones that form the Trilithon course at Baalbek weigh between 800 and 1,000 tons each. They were raised approximately 19 feet off the ground and fitted together with a precision that allows no visible joint between them. Still sitting in the nearby quarry, never moved, is a single stone known as the Stone of the Pregnant Woman. It weighs approximately 1,650 tons. It was cut, shaped, and prepared for transport. Something stopped the work before it was moved. No one knows what. To move a stone of 800 tons today requires purpose-built hydraulic lifting systems that take weeks to assemble, road surfaces capable of bearing the load, and precision engineering coordination across a large team. None of the infrastructure that would be required to move these stones to their current position has been found at Baalbek. No ramp system capable of raising them to 19 feet has ever been demonstrated in a working model. The mainstream explanation, manpower and ramps, has been applied to every megalithic site in the world as a universal answer. At Baalbek, that answer has never been proven. It has simply been repeated. The same polygonal megalithic style, massive unmortared stones fitted in irregularly shaped interlocking courses, appears at Sacsayhuaman in Peru, at Mycenae in Greece, at Hattusa in Turkey, and at Nan Madol in Micronesia. The Romans looked at Baalbek and built on top of it. The greatest engineers of the ancient world saw that platform and did not claim they could replicate it. The Göbekli Tepe builders had the wrong heads. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd noticed a strange stone protruding from a hillside in southeastern Turkey, near the city of Şanlıurfa. He reported it to the local museum. What archaeologist Klaus Schmidt and the German Archaeological Institute began excavating there over the following 3 decades rewrote the timeline of human civilization at its foundation. Göbekli Tepe was carbon dated to at least 9600 BC. It is 6,000 years older than Stonehenge. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000 years. And according to the standard academic model of human development, it should not exist. The site should not exist because at 9600 BC, humans were supposed to be hunter-gatherers, living in small nomadic bands without the social organization, the surplus resources, or the technical capacity to build anything at this scale. Göbekli Tepe features T-shaped limestone pillars weighing up to 20 tons, carved with animal reliefs of extraordinary skill, arranged in circular enclosures that required coordinated labor from a population of significant size. Agriculture is supposed to have enabled civilization. Göbekli Tepe was built before agriculture. The conventional sequence, farming first, then monuments, has been inverted by a single hillside in Turkey. In 2017, a paper published in the Journal of Human Evolution by researcher Julia Tello and colleagues reported something that received far less attention than the architecture. Human skull fragments recovered at Göbekli Tepe showed deliberate post-mortem modification. They had been carved. They had been drilled. They were prepared, in Tello's interpretation, for ritual suspension and display. The skulls were not buried. They were curated. Separately, a 2017 paper by Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis, published in Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry, argued that Pillar 43 at the site, known as the Vulture Stone, encodes an astronomical record of a major comet impact event dating to approximately 10,900 BC. Around 8,000 BC, the builders of Göbekli Tepe backfilled the entire site. They buried it deliberately, carefully, completely. The oldest temple ever found was hidden by the people who built it. They encoded a catastrophe in stone, curated the skulls of their dead, and then covered all of it. Not because they abandoned it, because they chose to. The stargates of ancient Sumer. In the collection of the Museum of the Ancient Near East in Berlin, there sits a small carved cylinder seal, catalogued as VA-243. Its age is estimated at approximately 5,000 years. It was made in Sumer. And carved into its surface is an image that, depending on who is reading it, is either a standard ancient Near Eastern star symbol surrounded by decorative elements, or a diagram of the solar system showing all major planets in their correct orbital positions, including bodies that humanity would not officially identify until the 19th century AD. Zecharia Sitchin, in his analysis of the seal, identified the central image as the Sun, with 11 orbiting bodies arranged around it, including what he interpreted as a large planet between Mars and Jupiter, where the asteroid belt now sits. Mainstream scholarship reads the central element as a stellar symbol rather than the Sun, and does not accept Sitchin's orbital interpretation. That disagreement matters, and it should be stated clearly. But the broader astronomical sophistication of Sumerian culture is not a fringe claim. The MUL.APEN tablets, a systematic record of stellar and planetary motion, demonstrate that Sumerian astronomers tracked the sky with a precision that informed every subsequent astronomical tradition in the ancient world. Researchers have noted that Sumerian texts appear to reference celestial bodies not formally cataloged in Western astronomy until millennia later, though this claim remains contested. In April of 2003, during the opening days of the Iraq War, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad was looted. Approximately 15,000 artifacts disappeared in the space of 48 hours. The National Library burned for days. The Natural History Museum was stripped. U.S. forces were positioned outside the Iraq Museum during the looting. The military museum containing weapons was guarded and left intact. The cuneiform tablet archive, containing tens of thousands of unread Sumerian texts, was among the material lost. The looting has never been fully investigated. The missing tablets have never been recovered. The oldest civilization on Earth left behind a written record of who taught them, what those beings knew, and where they came from. In 2003, a significant portion of that record was removed from the world while cameras broadcast a different story. Whether that was coincidence depends entirely on how much coincidence you are still willing to carry. The skull that doesn't fit the species. In the deepest occupation layer of Eridu, the city that Sumerian texts name as the first city ever built on Earth, and that archaeologists date to approximately 5400 BC, excavators working in the tradition of Sir Leonard Woolley's landmark digs at nearby found something that has never been comfortably absorbed into the standard account. The bones were human. The skulls, in certain specimens from Ubaid period burial sites associated with this region were not standard. Some researchers examining skulls recovered from Ubaid layer contexts have noted cranial elongation that does not present the characteristic markers of artificial binding, no cradleboard impressions, no asymmetrical compression patterns, no circumferential groove lines. The elongation appears, in these cases, to be the natural architecture of the skull rather than the product of an external reshaping process. Now look at the figurines. The Ubaid culture, spanning from approximately 5400 to 4000 BC across southern Mesopotamia, produced a body of fired clay figurines found at Eridu, Tel Alubaid, and Ur. These figurines have elongated heads. They have narrow, almond-shaped eyes, set in faces, that are not proportioned like human faces. They are shown in postures of nursing, of authority, of worship. They are the oldest known artistic depictions of whoever the Ubaid people considered their ruling class. No mainstream consensus exists on what these figures represent. Museum catalogs at the British Museum and elsewhere classify them as cult objects of unknown significance. That classification has remained unchanged for over a century. The Sumerians who came after the Ubaid culture wrote down the names of those who ruled them. They wrote down where those rulers came from. They wrote down what those rulers did to the human population. They described elongated, powerful beings who arrived before civilization, who administered its construction, and who departed when their work was done. The figurines in the cases match the descriptions in the texts. The skulls in the ground match the figurines above it. In the oldest city ever built, in the deepest layer of the oldest dig, they found skulls that don't belong to the people being buried around them. The Sumerians already knew what those skulls were. They wrote it down. We simply stopped reading. What you have just encountered is not a collection of isolated curiosities. It is a convergence. The Paracas skulls exhibit biological features that binding cannot produce. The Ubaid figurines depict those same features as the face of authority across the oldest civilization on Earth. The Sumerian texts name the beings those figurines represent and describe their agenda in administrative detail. The DNA results, unverified but unreplicated by any effort to disprove them, point toward a lineage with no known origin. The architecture at Baalbek and Göbekli Tepe was built by hands that the standard human timeline cannot account for. Every thread in this list pulls toward the same knot. Something moved through the ancient world that was not quite us. It ruled. It built. It was recorded. And then, layer by layer, the record was buried, lost, looted, or filed under unknown significance. The question is not whether the evidence exists. You have seen it. The question is what you are prepared to do with what you now know. Go to the comments right now and tell us which item changed the way you see the ancient world. Make your case. The floor belongs to you, and this community is the right place to build it. Subscribe, because the archive here is only getting deeper.